Hello, everybody. Good day. My name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by none other than Historian Garrett Peck. Welcome, Garrett.
Thank you, John. Great to be here.
Yeah, Garrett is the author of many books, but for our purposes today, on this Walt Whitman's 201st birthday, is that right?
Yeah, 201st, yes.
201st. So for the purposes of this day, May 31st, we're focusing on Garrett's book, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman in Washington, D.C., the Civil War and America's Great Poet. And if you're interested in picking up a copy, we proudly sell it at the museum. Though our doors are closed, you can reach out to us via email at store@civilwarmed.org, and we can work on getting a copy out to you. So we're going to talk about that. Before we get into that, I just want to say thank you again for tuning in to our videos. Please like and share them so more people can see them. Please consider liking our YouTube or liking our Facebook page and subscribing to our YouTube channel in order to stay up to date with all the latest interviews and videos that we're putting out there. And if you can, we'd love for you to consider becoming a member of the museum. Since our doors have been closed, we're not bringing in any admission. So those memberships really let us continue to do exciting interviews and things like this. So if you can, it would mean a great deal to us. If you're not at the point where you can become a member, even just a small donation really helps us out. Or if for whatever reason you don't want to be a member or make a donation, maybe you can consider getting Garrett's book. And if you're on the fence about that, maybe we can convince you over the course of this next 20, 30 minutes here. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get into this. So to start off with, tell us a little bit about yourself, Garrett, and why you felt compelled to write about Walt Whitman.
Cool. I live in Arlington, Virginia, where I'm under, like everyone else, we're sort of under under quarantine right now. So the state has not lifted our restrictions yet for Northern Virginia. But I've been an author, historian, and tour guide now for well over a dozen years. And I've long read Walt Whitman and been intrigued by Civil War history and whatnot. And as we had the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, several years ago, and I was looking at kind of the timing of how, especially as we're looking at the commemoration of the end of the war and Lincoln's assassination, and I realized that Walt's partner Peter Doyle was in Ford's Theater and witnessed the assassination, and I thought, okay, that's it. I had already envisioned a book about Walt Whitman in Washington, and I thought immediately, okay, that's when I need to bring the book out. It needs to be brought out for this really, really important anniversary. And so, yeah, it was kind of the timing. It got it out in March of 2015.
There you go. Yeah, timing is everything, as they say. So the book obviously focuses on Whitman's D.C. years. About when did he move to the city? Where did he move from? How long did he live there? And maybe where did he live for people that know the D.C. area well?
Yeah. So Walt is very, very famous for coming here to DC and doing all this hospital volunteering. And that's what he's really, really famous for this. And there's a bit of a myth about this, by the way. We need to shatter that right away. If you ask everyone, what did Walt do during the Civil War? Almost everyone says, oh, he was a nurse. That's actually not true. He was a hospital volunteer. That's different. He took on a role that no one asked him to do. He did not get paid to do this. He was more like a one-person USO, going into the hospital wards and bed to bed, enormously empathetic person. And would talk to every single soldier and just find out whatever they needed, and he tried to provide it for them. So this was not a nursing skill. He didn't have that skill set. As far as Walt's background, Walt was like an early hipster. He was from Brooklyn and and lived with his mother, so sort of like an early millennial,
That's great.
He had this incredible moment that happens during the Civil War. There's the Battle of Fredericksburg takes place, and there's 9 Whitman kids, by the way, and only one of them has served in the Army, and that is his brother George, George Washington. And he is wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And Walt reads about it in the newspaper and decides he's going to get down there to the battlefront and find his brother. I mean, like, why would someone do this? But he did. And that's really what kicked off his hospital volunteering. He saw the conditions on the battlefield and the camps and whatnot. And he went back with a couple of Union Army soldiers from Brooklyn to get them situated in the Washington, D.C. hospitals, and just saw how they were treated how they were treated when they were dropped off at the D.C. waterfront and there were no ambulances waiting for them. And it was December of 1862 and really cold. They had no blankets. And he was very compassionate towards these men. And very quickly, he picked out this role for himself, that he was going to go volunteer in the hospitals for the comfort and morale of the soldiers themselves.
Yeah, that personal connection always really seems to kind of jumpstart people. That's sort of how it was for Clara Barton in the very first days of the war, before really any fighting had broken out. The 6th Massachusetts makes their way to Washington. There's sort of a riot in Baltimore, and a number of those people were from her hometown, and that kind of makes it a sort of a personal thing right away. And of course, these people are tremendously compassionate, and that's one of there are a variety of legacies of the Civil War, some good and some bad, but one of the good ones is just that, in times of crisis, compassionate people really kind of step up, and it's an incredible example for us to follow today, during our own time of crisis.
Yeah. I'm always so impressed by both Clara Barton and Walt Whitman. Again, no one asked them to do what they did. They simply saw an opportunity to serve other people. They didn't wear uniforms. Neither one was going to serve in the military, but they found another way to serve.
Exactly, and of course they're just two notable people. There's a slew of people whose names we don't know or are not as well known.
Yeah, and you think about that for today as well, about all the people who are making contributions, whether they're working in hospitals, and during this pandemic, whether they're the garbage people or working in a hospital, or the person delivering your groceries or working in the grocery store. They're putting their own health and their own lives at risk to support the rest of us. And I feel like it's a huge debt that we owe, and it's a huge unthanked burden.
Absolutely. So by the time Walt Whitman moved to Washington, D.C., he had already published Leaves of Grass. Is that right?
Yeah, he actually had published 3 editions of Leaves of Grass.
Oh, excellent.
In 1855.
So how well known was Walt Whitman? To what degree was he a celebrity in the 19th century by the time he got to DC?
I'd say by 1860, when he got here in December of 1862, Walt did in fact try to look for federal work, but he was well known among higher circles. The working class and so on didn't really know who he was, but he was more infamous than famous, because especially the 3rd edition of Leaves of Grass, which came out in 1860, shortly before the secession crisis, that included a number of poems that dealt with sexuality, including The Sons of Adam, and which was deemed to be inappropriate for women to read. And so when he went applying for jobs, people were like, "Oh, we know who you are. No sense in you applying." And that held him back from getting a federal job all the way until 1865.
Fascinating. As someone that is not nearly as knowledgeable about Walt Whitman, I was sort of envisioning, when people would see him, like, "Oh, Walt Whitman, all right, how's it going?" But it's more like, "Ooh, that's Walt Whitman."
Yeah.
Fascinating. So
he hadn't yet become America's great poet. He certainly was ambitious. He wanted to become that, but he wasn't there quite yet.
And is that something? So of course, towards the conclusion of the Civil War, or perhaps even during, he publishes, I'm blanking on the name, something about drums.
Drum taps.
Drum taps, that's right. A collection of Civil War poems. Does that kind of gain him a little bit more, does that make him more well-known?
It certainly does. He produces drum taps. He initially starts to produce it in early 1865, and it's his collection of Civil War poems. And then the war ends, and Lincoln is assassinated. So he immediately stops the presses, literally. He stops the publication of the book because he's got new material to add. And that includes 3 poems about Abraham Lincoln. So very famously, of course, "Oh, Captain, My Captain" comes from drum taps, which is an okay poem. It's not one of his great poems, but he he includes in this book probably his very last great poem, and he knocks it out of the park. And that's the poem "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed," and that's about the Lincoln funeral, without ever naming Lincoln by name, but it's, you know, right away it's about Lincoln.
Sure.
And so anyways, he brings that out in the fall of 1865, and that really puts Whitman on the map. So, and this is where he gets this name for himself as being a Lincoln poet.
Right, that kind of trilogy of poems that gets added. Again, talk about timing. And you know, I'm certainly Walt Whitman wouldn't have wished for that, but timing is everything, you know, as we've already mentioned. You've talked a little bit about, you know, his hospital volunteer experience during the Civil War. Do you have any sense, you know, how common that, like, to what degree Walt Whitman was exceptional in that way? I mean, obviously there are plenty sort of nameless individuals that you know gave their services, but any idea, you know, how common or uncommon Walt Whitman was in DC doing that sort of volunteering?
Yeah, I think, well, the hospitals themselves were open to everyone. So day or night, you could simply just walk right on in. And so they got lots of evangelicals came by trying to convert the soldiers, which annoyed them all. Lots of families could come by as well. So we see photographs of the inside of hospitals with family visitors coming by and so on. So certainly there were other volunteers who came by and did similar work that Walt did. What is exceptional about Walt is the fact he did this for 3 years. And he estimated that during this time, he made around 600 hospital visits and helped out between 80,000 and 100,000 soldiers, both Union and Confederate soldiers who were in these Washington, D.C. based hospitals. So it's an incredible humanitarian achievement. And again, he did not get paid for this. So he had to raise funds, largely through his brother Jeff up in Brooklyn, to be able to buy the things for the soldiers that they needed. And it's really amazing what Walt did.
Absolutely, and again, that is reminiscent of Clara Barton's experience. I mean, Clara Barton basically goes broke over the course of the Civil War, basically buying supplies and things for soldiers in hospitals, and you know, things end up working out for her, you know, in the aftermath of the war. But it's this whole volunteer business. It's not easy. And it requires a great degree of personal sacrifice, not just in time, but in terms of money. And that's interesting that Walt Whitman kind of experienced that as well. You alluded to this a little bit. I want to focus a little bit more specifically on it. What would one of his days look like when he goes into a hospital, like on one of his days off from? Because I presume he was working as a clerk during the war when he was in DC.
He actually got his first full-time federal job in January of 1865.
Oh, okay.
And he was working for for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you know, in the Patent Office building, which is now the Smithsonian American Art Museum and National Portrait Gallery. So that's his first full-time job. He did, though, in 1863, get a part-time job working in the Army Paymaster office. So he'd go there every morning, probably 10 a.m. or so. Walt was a late riser. And he'd go over there. He had very good penmanship. And so that's why they hired him to copy documents. And he'd go there, work about 3 hours or so, and he made enough money to pay his rent. Mm-hmm. And then in the afternoons, he'd start making his hospital visits. And he would go by. The one he made the most hospital visits to was the hospital at Armory Square. And that's where the National Air and Space Museum is today. That's the hospital that was closest to the waterfront. And most of the soldiers came in, the wounded soldiers came in via boat. And so that's where they were dropped off. So the worst cases went a half a mile right to that hospital. All the others who needed more long-term recovery, who were in such bad health, were kind of sent to other hospitals. There was kind of a ring of hospitals all the way around DC, and in a circle, basically. And that's where they were distributed all around the city. And so Walt visited most of those hospitals, just checked in with the soldiers. Again, he'd go bed to bed, talk to every single soldier in the hospital wards, find out what they needed. If they wanted, like one soldier at one point asked for a rice pudding. So he went to one of his friends and asked, "Hey, can you make this?" She did. And he came back and gave it to the soldier. And so, yeah, part of that was go see the soldiers, then go shopping, find out whatever they need, then bring it back to them.
Mm.
So he had
Yeah,
this leather satchel he took with him. It's down in the Library of Congress. So that he carried paper with him and pencils and stamps and some reading material, and it's pretty amazing. So he was a little, I wouldn't say entrepreneurial about this, but he had to figure out how to make this thing work and how to work out the financing and so on.
right. There was a system to it that he developed.
Mhm.
You just love that kind of personal one-on-one connection.
Mhm.
That it seems he was very intentional about forging.
Yeah.
What do you specifically need, or even what do you want,
Mhm.
which is sort of a different question,
Yeah.
especially for long-term recovery, which could, I would have to imagine, tend to be fairly boring.
And that's what all these hospitals in DC and Philadelphia, Baltimore, et cetera, these were all long-term recovery places. Because if you've been to the museum, for all of you fans, you realize that the Union Army and the Confederate Army had field hospitals for patching up wounds, that kind of stuff. But for soldiers who couldn't get better, who had an arm amputated and needed long-term care, or I mean, the big killer in the Civil War was diarrhea. Um, they got those soldiers out of the battlefield, out of the hospitals, and sent them up to the long-term care facilities, of which DC, of course, was a major center for those. And that's where Walt, of course, was doing his work. So these were all long-term care and recovery facilities, essentially.
Right. So Walt could come into these places and interact with a soldier and have a reasonable assumption that they would be there when he came back in the
Mhm.
next, day or two or whenever.
Yeah, he made lifelong friends. I mean, people wrote him throughout the rest of his life thanking him for his friendship to them during the war. He made a lot of friends
Mm.
serving all these different soldiers.
Yeah, that's a great point. That these relationships don't just end in 1865. That's probably one of the greatest fallacies of Civil War historians. In so many cases, their work just sort of arbitrarily ends in 1865. But these relationships, um, and even the events, they have impacts and
Yeah.
that go long beyond that year. So that's such a great thing to mention. Um, Talking about, so Walt Whitman, of course, is, a man who wore many hats over the course of his life. Of course, poet, his time as a volunteer, nurse, brother, lover, clerk, etc. They've been written about by yourself, by many other folks. Which of those kind of parts of Walt Whitman do you think either doesn't get enough play, or maybe hasn't been written about in the way that you think it ought to be?
Yeah.
Um, Say more about that.
Yeah. I think the part that gets overlooked the most, and it may seem a little boring, but it's his work as a federal clerk. Um, we all know that Walt came here to DC during the Civil War, and that's what we all think, like, oh, well, then poof, what did he do afterwards? No one knows, but he actually stayed here in DC because he got a job. He was a federal clerk, and he was in DC for 10 years, which is remarkable. And this was a life-changing event for him. And really, during this time, he was established as America's great poet, and he achieved international recognition and so on. But the clerks in the federal government were basically the people who made the government work. The typewriter was not invented until around 1870, so everything was copied by hand. So he wrote speeches for government officials. And by the way, a couple years ago, there was one person researching through the National Archives, and they found, I think, over 1,000 documents that Walt had drafted as a clerk. And these were not
That's cool.
poetic documents. These were government documents, drafts
Right.
of different things. But they recognized the handwriting and saw the different drafts of speeches and whatnot, and comments on the side and whatnot. And it's just a treasure trove. They did digitize this collection, so it's online now, which is pretty amazing. It's not romantic stuff, but it's the stuff that we all do every day. We process email and whatnot, most of which is not going to really be all that interesting to historians, but you never know. In the future, someone might take interest in your Instagram posts. So, so I think this is one of those things that is really, really overlooked. This time from 1865 on until he suffers a stroke in 1873, he is part of this dazzling literary salon of his fellow federal clerks. They're very, very well educated. They're well read, and they get together every day at 5 o'clock and have tea and discuss the issues of the day. And people afterwards remark that they were really really kind of heartbroken that no one ever took any notes. They had the best
Mm.
conversations, and if you could have been a fly on the wall,
Oh,
William
man.
Burroughs being there and John Burroughs and so on, like it would have been incredible. Anthony Trollope, the famous novelist, visited one of their sessions, and that would have been incredible. Someone could write a play.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah,
it would write itself.
yeah.
So yeah, that's I love that you bring that up and that you highlight that. I mean, so much of the human life is, I don't want to say drudgery. That's maybe putting a bad spin on it, but not the thing you're going to tell your grandkids about.
Mhm.
And like it makes me think of well-known artists that before they catch their big break, they have to work a job to sort of get the bills paid, which
Mhm.
I'm sure as time went on it became less and less maybe essential. But I'm sure there was a piece of them that maybe kind of enjoyed just writing neat handwriting and all that. But I enjoy that you point that out.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's important, I'm a writer myself, and I've long told people who go into writing, don't quit your day job, because it's basically it's hobby income.
Mhm.
So um, Walt he'd gone from a whole series of jobs. He was a trained journalist, but he just kind of went from job to job to job. And finally, when he landed this federal clerk job, it really gave him a solid foundation. I mean, he was really in the ranks of the middle class / upper middle class. This was the most stable portion of his life. And there's something to be said for having a day job. It does really ground you. And we think about how many, at this moment in the pandemic, how many people don't have jobs, and what's that going to do for the long term? It's a little scary, both for people's psyche. Work is so important for people. It's where I think, especially as Americans, we sort of ground ourselves in our work. We identify ourselves through our work. So think about all those people who are temporarily without work right now. Work was certainly good for Walt and having that steady paycheck. And that enabled him as well to keep writing his poetry and kept publishing updates to it and whatnot.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Uh, Talking about, some of Walt Whitman's most famous poems dealing with Abraham Lincoln, uh, did they have a relationship? Did they know each other? What did that look like?
Yeah. Walt and Abraham Lincoln never actually met, which
Hmm.
is such a shame. And Walt had a huge bromance on
I mean,
on
don't
Abraham
we
Lincoln.
all?
What's that?
I said, don't we all?
Yeah, yeah. So even though Walt was really a New York Democrat, and typically New York Democrats didn't like Republicans, but their values were really aligned. Both of them supported the Union. Both of them understood this war had to be fought. Both of them were abolitionists and understood slavery had to come to an end. In Walt's case, he lived in 6 different places in D.C. over his decade. The very first place he lived was with William Douglas O'Connor, and he rented a room, and that was at Vermont Avenue and L Street. So it's right along the route that Lincoln was taking to and from Soldiers' Home.
Mhm.
And so Walt remarked in this New York Times column that he saw the president every day coming to and from his country lodgings. And so he'd go out there along with the public to see him. He adds this really intriguing line. He adds this in 1876 in Memoranda during the war, where he says, the president and I have taken to giving each other very courteous bows or very courteous nods at each other. And that's a little suspicious just because of the fact that this is based off the New York Times article, but he has appended this one last sentence in 1876, 13 years after the fact. And it's like, really, dude? Okay, are you just making that up? Or, maybe they did nod at each other, who knows? But I think in part he needed some kind of posthumous recognition from Lincoln because he was so internationally recognized, Whitman was, by this point, as a Lincoln poet. Walt went to the White House twice on New Year's Day. You could go, the White House was open, and you can go shake the hand of the president. But as soon as Walt got there to the White House, saw how long the line was, he turned around. He was an introvert. I know exactly how he feels. See a line like that, like, oh, not doing it. I'm going to go home. Like huge crowds, like, no, run. No. So he always figured, oh, I'll meet the president some other time. He never got the opportunity to shake the man's hand. Never. It's really a shame. And we don't know whether Lincoln knew about Whitman or not. It's just a huge open question.
And that should be another kind of takeaway from all this is, don't put things off too long until later, because you really never know.
Yeah.
If there's something that you want to do it.
Yeah. Carpe diem, right? Dead
Mm-hmm,
Poet Society.
absolutely.
Remember that with the Oh Captain, My Captain, and the picture they had of Walt? Remember that in the movie?
Which movie?
In the movie Dead Poet Society. So Robin Williams.
It's been a long time since
Yeah.
I've seen
So
that.
everyone watching this here today, you have some little homework. John, you have homework too. Go
Absolutely.
rewatch Dead Poet Society, because it's got the poem "Oh Captain, My Captain" figures very prominently in the plot, and a picture of Walt Whitman too.
Oh, excellent. Well, I'll
Yeah.
definitely make sure and go and rewatch that. My memory of it was that it was very good.
Yeah.
It's well worth the rewatch.
Yeah. You'll see how Ethan Hawke, when he's really, really young, is in it.
I tend to think you're probably right. Whitman probably did append that last sentence. We bow to each other, whenever he goes by. But I love to imagine, just when you said that Lincoln didn't know Whitman by name, and he's like, oh, that's the bow guy.
Yeah.
And every time we go, we're like, hey, bow guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they would. I mean, probably not, but I'd like to believe that was their relationship.
Yeah.
Well, as we come to a close here, do you have any particularly favorite Whitman poems that come to mind? Either ones that are well known or ones that might not be as well known.
Yeah. I love Lilacs. That is such a moving poem. By the way, it takes about 10 minutes to read it. Plus, you do need a couple breaks and get the Kleenex, because it's a devastating poem. The other one of my favorite poems, and it's just a metaphysical mind breaker, like it's incredible, is Crossing Brooklyn Ferry.
Crossing Brooklyn Ferry.
Yeah, and it's amazing. And back then there were all these ferries. The Brooklyn Bridge hadn't been built yet, so there were ferry boats that took you across. And he has this metaphysical vision of him being on the ferry and thinking ahead across the space-time continuum. What I'm doing right now, future people will be doing the same thing. And what is a bit of space and time to us? We can reach out to across each other, across time, and realize we're all the same. We're all doing the same thing, and it's just like.
That's cool. Well,
like, wow.
talk about the erosion of space in the midst of the pandemic. I mean, I'm in West Virginia, you're in Virginia, and we're both talking about Walt Whitman. We're doing the same thing. I mean, not the exact point that he's getting at, but it's
he's
what
reaching out across history and time to us right now, and reconnecting us to him. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Absolutely, and that's such a beautiful thought, and I think that's a great place to end on today.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Garrett, for joining us today. I know I had fun. I hope you did too.
I did. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me on here. And thank you all to the supporters of the museum. It's a really critical time here that we support our institutions.
Absolutely. And just a friendly reminder, like the video, share the video. It'll take 3 seconds of your time, I promise. Or your free money back. And if you can, consider becoming a member of the museum. And those of you that have recently become members, thank you so much. It does give you a discount in our store where you can purchase. You can't go to our stores right now, but you can email us at store@civilwarmed.org and write in and request Garrett's book, Walt Whitman in Washington, D.C., The Civil War and America's Great Poet. And if you don't want to read it after this conversation, well, I can't help you. So we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time, whenever that is.